A long time ago, I figured out that I'm more of a cabinet maker than a furniture maker. Where I live, no one will pay you what it takes to do a dovetail drawer. So we make our drawers I guess it's really a 5-piece plywood box. And we make the drawer sides out of Baltic birch plywood, which is exactly a 1/2 inch thick. And part of the reason that's important to me is the biggest challenge when you're making any drawer is getting it the right width so that the hardware works. Now, I use kind of a middle of the road hardware. It's an undermount so you don't see the slides once it's installed, but it's not full extension. This is just a really good functional drawer slide. I get these from Custom Service Hardware, and they install well. They always work for me, so once I've got something that works, I pretty well stay with it. Now, one of the things that you need to know whenever you get ready to build a drawer is some drawers hardware, the drawer box has to be 1 inch narrower than the opening. For this particular brand, I have to be 3/4 narrower. So what I'm going to start out by doing is I'm going to measure the opening of my cabinet face frame, and then I'll take that measurement and subtract 3/4 inch from it, and that's what the outside of my box needs to be. This opening is 22 11/16, so that would mean I need to be 21 15/16 wide. I better write that down. Okay, so the outside of the drawer box needs to be 21 15/16 wide. The great thing about this plywood, each side of my drawer side being 1/2 inch thick, is all I've got to do is subtract 1 inch from whatever final size I want my drawer box to be, and that's what the cross pieces of my box are cut at. Now, all that I did to make these drawer sides was I took some of that Baltic birch plywood. The one that we buy always comes in 5x5 sheets. So you cut these about 19 7/8 so that for every rip you can get 3 drawer sides. And that works plenty well enough for these drawers since they aren't full extensions. You could set up a table saw with a dado head to accept the plywood bottom. I use 1/4 inch plywood bottoms, just plenty strong enough for what I do. What I usually do is I'll just set up and do that in 2 passes on the table saw. By the time I got changed out to a dado head, I could have made them unless I was making like 100 drawers or something. So I usually just make 2 passes on the table saw, and I've gone about halfway through the thickness of the plywood. The other thing that I did was just took a 1/4 inch round over bit in a little small compact trim router, and I just eased these edges so it's a nice soft edge. Now I'm going to go back and double check my math one more time, and then I'll be ready to cut the front and the back component of this drawer box. Just to double check myself, the drawer box needed to be 21 15/16, so I've cut this at 20 15/16. I'm ready to go nail this in between the drawer sides. I use a 1/4 inch radius bit to soften this edge on the front of the drawer box. I'm just using some 1 1/4" 18 gauge brads to put these boxes together. If it was a really big box, I might use pocket screws on these joints too. And sometimes I've even used the pocket screws on the smaller one, but these brads really do a pretty good job holding this together. I use a piece of 1/2 inch Baltic birch on the front because it just seems a little more refined. It's not quite as bulky. On the back, we just use 3/4 inch plywood, and truthfully, that's kind of how we get rid of all the scrap 3/4 plywood that's laying around the shop. It's a great place to use it on the back of drawers. This drawer box is pretty well together now. The only thing that I need to do is measure pretty tight and cut my piece of 1/4 inch plywood to slide in. That is going to be 21 3/8 by about 20. I'm going to use the same staple gun to staple this drawer bottom that I used on the back of my cabinets. And since this is the front of the drawer where I'm going to be putting my drawer front on later, I want to make sure that this plywood doesn't hang past. The back doesn't really matter. So now the box is basically built. It's time to put the hardware on. This is how easy it is to install these undermounts drawer slides. Just going to put them right there in place. And you do want to drill a pilot hole. You can be tempted not to, but you do want to drill the pilot hole. Screws that I use, instead of being Phillips, are a square drive, so I can use the very same driver, the magnetic driver I use for my pocket screws. Now, really important that this doesn't stick out past the drawer box. It can be a little bit back, and that's okay, but you don't want it sticking out past it. May seem like a lot of screws, but I always go ahead and put one in every hole. Now this is ready to slide in the hole, but I've got to mount the tracks in the cabinet first. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about earlier that's kind of another thing you need to know besides how much width the box needs to have allowed for the hardware, you also have to know how much shorter does this box need to be than the opening in the cabinet face frame, because it's been a couple times I got it too tight and you have to do some real modifications to your drawer box to get it in. I'm pretty sure on this that I just leave this drawer box about 1 inch shorter than the opening. Now I'm going to install the drawer and begin the process of adjusting the fit. So the drawer's sliding in and out really well right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's in the place it needs to be for the drawer front to line up. I'm going to take this long straight edge and I'll put it in front. Well, that's hitting pretty well. That's about as good as I could adjust it right now. The next thing I need to check is the up and down. We've got just a tiny bit of gap at the top. So what that tells me is I need to raise those brackets up just a little bit at the back. Probably not even 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to put a little pencil mark where they are now, and then I'll raise them up a little bit. Now that's why I only put in 1 screw. Now that's what I'm talking about. I love it when they fit like this. You can't permanently screw everything together until you get the drawer front attached though, because sometimes if there's a little bit of twist or anything to the drawer front, you have to make some other adjustments. But for right now, that is absolutely as good as it gets. Before I put the drawer front in place, I want to have these two doors mounted, and the reason for that is it's really easy to get this drawer front right if I can just put a spacer on top of the doors, drop it down, and mount it in place. So I'm going to go ahead and build these two doors first. Now, I'm going to be using some European hinges that are overlay hinges, and each one of the doors needs to overlay this opening about 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to measure this way and add 3/4, and then I'm going to measure this way. Here we're getting into some math. Divide it in two and add about 3/8, maybe a little less than 3/8 since I want to have a gap in the middle. Let's do the easy part first. So the height is 20 1/4, so it needs to be, doors need to be 21 tall. Now the little bit more challenging part. This opening is right at 22 3/4. So I'm going to come over here 11 3/8, and I'm even going to flip the tape measure over to double check myself. That mark is in the center. Now I'm just going to add 3/8 over here. My door needs to be 11 3/4 wide. So I need to make the doors 11 3/4, maybe just a little bit under that to allow for a gap between the doors. I've made cabinet doors a lot of different ways, and I've got some really great tools in this shop to do it with. But the way I'm going to make these doors I really like because I can do it with 3 tools that just about every carpenter owns: a router, a Craig jig, and a miter saw. It's going to be a mitered frame that fits around a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, but you could even put a raised panel in if you want to. The cabinet door is based really on making a picture frame around a piece of plywood. These pieces go together like this, and you end up with a really nice profile that turns into a great looking cabinet door. Now the way that I put this together so I'm sure that I've got a really strong joint is I'm going to put a couple of the small micro pocket holes in the back, and the reason you want to use the micro jig is because it has a really close spacing on the 2 holes. It's a significantly smaller hole than you get with the bigger pocket screws. One of the things that I learned when I started doing doors this way is you want to put your pocket screws in the top piece or the rail, not the stile part of the door, because your hinges go into the stile part of the door, and there's a slight chance, depending on where you put your hinges, you could hit a pocket screw. So I'm just going to drop this piece into the jig. As soon as I can't see any more of this hole, that's when I know that I can clamp this in and drill it. Now, see how close those holes are together? You can only get that spacing with the micro jig. And as a bonus, it's a much smaller hole to plug when you do the plugs in the back. I'm ready to start assembling this. Now what I'm going to do is take one of my stiles and attach a rail on the top and bottom, and then I'll slide the plywood in and add the second stile. Now, I always like to put a little bit of a headless pin kind of to hold the long point in place, and that keeps things aligned while I drive these screws home. So I've got some pretty good joints. A couple of them are going to need a little bit of attention sanding. So what I'll do now is get my random orbit sander, kind of sand those joints, smooth them out, and the ones that have got just a tiny crack, I'll just rub a little glue in them. So I just drilled some 35mm cup holes in the back of these doors, and that's for these adjustable European hinges, which are absolutely wonderful because they have all sorts of adjustment to them. The main thing that you need to know though is this distance from the edge back in can vary from one hinge to the other. So if you have any question about where that hole needs to be drilled, just take a piece of wood that's the same size as your door and do a mock-up. It's a lot easier to do a test with a mock-up piece than to remake a door. That's really nice. One of the things I love about these Bloom hinges is you can adjust them 3 different ways: up, down, in and out. Lets you get a really great fit. I made both of the cuts for this stock that was the frame of the door with a handheld router. This was pretty straightforward. It's just a round over bit that you drop down enough to get a shoulder. This bead here is a little bit more challenging. Now I'm getting ready to make some of this bead and wrap it around the drawer front, but the cut that I'm going to make is done exactly the same way. I want to put 2 pieces of wood together so that I've got enough of a surface for my router to ride on, and then I just make a cut right down the side. I want to do all 4 edges of these 2 boards so I've got plenty of molding to wrap around that drawer front. Now what I need to do is just take this piece of the table saw and I'm going to cut right there so that I keep this little shoulder, and from here out will be the molding that'll miter around the plywood drawer front. I've been waiting to make this drawer front until I got these doors built and adjusted, because the drawer front should line up exactly with the outside of these 2 doors. And I've got 23 5/8. So I'm going to write that down. And then otherwise, I just want it to overlap about 3/8 top and bottom, so about 6 3/4. Now, what I'll have to do is subtract the thicknesses of 2 pieces of that molding we made from the overall dimensions so I get the right size piece of plywood for the middle. The outside dimensions of our drawer front to be 23 5/8. So that means I need to cut my piece of plywood to 22 7/8, just a little bit shy. Now, you notice I'm still using that Arkansas math technique so I don't make any mistakes. The later it gets in the day, the more important that is. Put a little bit of glue around here. Fit this piece. Get that bead to line up with the front. It actually sticks proud a little bit on the back, but that just means that this part is going to hit the face frame of the cabinet, and the middle of this will be mounted to the drawer box. Now all we have to do is mount this drawer face. I'm just going to get a little spacer set on top of the cabinet doors that'll hold this up just right, and then we'll screw through the drawer into the back of this front. So I've got the drawer front screwed in place. Now it's time that I can actually check and see if there's any little adjustments I need to make side to side, up or down. It's really fitting well there, so I don't think I need any adjustment that way. Over here, I'm a little bit away, so I may need to swing the bracket slightly that way to move this over. Make sure that I mark exactly where I'm at. Okay, that took care of that. This drawer fits just like I want it. I'm going to put about 3 more screws in there, a couple at least in each bracket, maybe 3, and we'll be good to go.